Hello, and welcome to Monroeville's Historic Houses. My name is Lewis Chandler, and I'm a local historian here who will be your host for today's tour. We invite you to pause here and step back with us into that quieter, simpler time. I'd like to welcome you to McGinley House, one of our historic houses here in Monroeville. And this particular house was built in 1830 by a guy named Joseph McClintock. Now McClintock built this house for his family, and he was a stonemason, so you can imagine it was a pretty well built house. Over time, this house has been lived in continuously right into the 1970s, and eventually it became a part of the borough of Monroeville's possession, and then the Historical Society took over as mentors of the house, and we kind of run it and oversee the things today. The original house would have been from this entrance here where we're speaking to the fireplace, and that would have been the size of the house. Now the size was at that time, in those days, called a mansion. It's actually very large for this sort of thing, and on old maps it's called the McGinley Mansion. As it turned out, McClintock had a daughter who married into the McGinley family, married a guy named Isaac McGinley, and that gave the house its historic name, the McGinley House. This is the master bedroom of the McGinley House. And in those days, in the 19th century, particularly in these farmhouses, the bedroom was a very important place, and the bed was a very important feature of the house, a piece of furniture. Everyone was very proud of their beds. There was always curved features to them. They were well made, and this is a typical kind of bed you would have found in one of those houses. The interesting thing about this particular house here is that you see over here a fireplace. Now, that's a very rare thing. You won't find that in most 19th century farmhouses because the second floor didn't have heat. This is a fireplace. This guy was a stonemason. He built a second fireplace on the second floor and tied it into the one that's going up to the chimney from below. So there was heat in this room. Mostly in the farmhouses of this time, there was no heat. You depended mostly on quilts, like the kind you see here on the bed, or a pan with hot coals, which would be put underneath the bed and to warm it up and then taken away. And that was the way that some heat was provided. But you didn't have a heated bedroom as such. Over here on the wall, you see a picture of the McGinley family. Now, this is the family that began the house in the 1830s. Isaac McGinley and his wife and their daughter, their young daughter at that point in time. And they would have had a picture like this perhaps over the bed, which would have been a feature of the bedroom. Taking a little walk over here to the side, we see some of the furniture that would be typical 19th century furniture. And here there's a picture of a farm woman, and this happens to be Mrs. Betty Miller. Now what happened was, in the 1920s, this farm had been in the McGinley family continuously from 1830 to the 1920s. It was sold, and then it went into receivership because of the Great Depression. The family lost the farm, and for several years it stood idle, actually starting to fall apart, when a guy from Squirrel Hill in Pittsburgh, a businessman, a Jewish businessman named Max Miller, who was a real estate guy, heard about this place. Max had no interest in the country at all, and this was country then at that point. But his wife, Betty, was a farm girl. She grew up on a farm. She always wanted to be back on the farm. And she just sort of pestered him to find a place in the country where they could go. And so Max gave in, and they bought the old McGinley place in the 1930s, 1932. And Betty moved out here. At first, they moved out for a few weeks during the summer. It was like a summer place. But eventually, Max didn't want to have any part of this thing, and Betty wanted more of it, and so she moved out. He passed away shortly afterwards, and when she moved here, she asked her brothers, who were a couple of guys from Turtle Creek named the Solomon boys, the Solomons had their own farm, if they'd come up here and help her with the farm. So the farm became, at that point in the 1930s, the Miller-Solomon Farm. And there's a lot of records relating to that, and there's some pictures on our website which you'll find very interesting. As it turned out, Mrs. Miller was one of these sort of characters. Everybody loved Mrs. Miller. They said that neighbors would walk past and she'd invite them over for a pie or something that was on the stove, you know. And they always had big family gatherings on Sundays. All the family would gather from around, and Mrs. Miller would take care of everything. She was the all-around farm lady. Did all the work, did all the cooking, always welcomed people, and it was a very congenial kind of place, and everyone in the neighborhood knew the Millers. Mrs. Miller also had in charge of all the turkeys and chickens and a lot of the farm animals, and this is a picture of her there. And this woman in the back, she's a kid at the time, about 12 years old, was the ward of Mrs. Miller. And this ward, which is at that time in the 1940s would have been Clara Louise. She's now in Georgia and lives in a small place in the backwoods of Georgia somewhere, and she's 90-some years old, and we've recently been in touch with her. So she was very pleased to hear that we're still keeping up the house and trying to get it together. Mrs. Miller eventually lived with her sister here in the house, and the two old ladies ran the place as much as they could until such point as they couldn't do it anymore. In the 1970s, Westinghouse bought this property, the property next door, a good portion of the hillside, for their new nuclear center. When they did, one of our guys from the Historical Society who was on council talked to the Westinghouse folks and said, hey, how about preserving that farmhouse? Just that little piece of land there. So the arrangement was that the farmhouse and the land it sat on would go to the borough of Monroeville, with a proviso that the two women who were living here could live here for the rest of their lives, or until they couldn't manage on their own anymore. And that happened sometime in the 70s. They moved out. Mrs. Miller ended up in a senior care place, and at that point, the Historical Society took over the management of the house. Well, this is the Joel Monroe room. We named it there because it was named after Joel Monroe, and people can probably understand that the word Monroeville has a connection to a guy named Joel Monroe. Joel was a farmer from Virginia, and he came north in it wasn't free land, but it was cheaper land here in the north, plus the Pennsylvania authorities were trying to get people from Virginia to move to Pennsylvania because there was some arguments with the folks in Virginia about who owned this place. So he was part of that wave of immigrants that came north and bought a farm in what it would be today's center of Monroeville. If you're familiar with Monroeville and you know that Route 22 is the center road, and there's an overpass there that goes up to our borough building. And right at that crossroads would have been where Joel Monroe's farm was. So it would be really the center of Monroeville today. Joel began to develop his farm, and one of the things that concerned him was that they couldn't get mail here. He had to go to Turtle Creek to get his mail. And so they found out that they could petition the federal government for a post office. And that was done. But the post office said, yeah, but you know what? You need a name for your village. And so the name became that of the first postmaster, Joel Monroe. And that's how we ended up being Monroeville. This is some of the things about Joel and his family. They weren't here all that long, but they were certainly here long enough to create part of the town. Joel began to sell off lots along Route 22. So he was the first farmer to actually cut lots out of his farm on the road so that people who were having shops, like a blacksmith, for example, or an innkeeper, could have a piece of the land right on the road. And in a sense, then, he began to build the village of Monroeville. This is Mrs. Monroe's wedding dress. We were actually very lucky to get this piece from a donor, and you can see it's dark, it's black. Wedding dresses at that time would never have been white. They would have thought that that was an incredible expense, and it wasn't a very practical thing at all. Remember that in these farmhouses, things were very dusty and dirty. Kitchens particularly were sooty, and so a dark dress like this would have been the thing that they would have worn, plus the fact that you didn't buy a wedding dress once for one occasion and then put it away. You wore the dress. They were much more practical than we were about those kinds of things. So this is her wedding dress. Some of the things that you're going to see in here come from the Monroe family, and that legacy is a result of a woman named Soy, Rebecca Gillis Soy. Rebecca was the great, several greats, granddaughter of Joel Monroe, and she passed away in California a few years ago. And when she did, she gave us some of this materials that you see here in this room. They were furnishings and artifacts that were up in the farmhouse, which was across the street from the original Monroe farm. On the other side of the street, there was a little bit of a hill, and there still is now. There's a hill, and there's a set of apartments there. It used to be called Northern Pike Apartments. But right up there was a house named Hillcrest Farm. Hillcrest was one of these places that was sort of the center of the community. Everybody knew what Hillcrest was. They had lawn parties, they had weddings there, they would celebrate 4th of July. This was well before we had things like the Senior Citizen Center or center of the town, and so people would congregate on one of the farms, and Hillcrest was that place. There's some pictures we have of weddings at Hillcrest, and it was just a well-known piece of our community back in the early 1900s. And over here you see the various pieces of artifacts and objects that were taken from the house. As you can see, these were not poor farmers. They had some money, and they were able to bring in plate from the eastern part of the country and even import some things. So by the time of Hillcrest, the farmers had prospered and done pretty well for themselves. This is the main room, or what we would call today the living room, or they would have called the parlor for the farmhouse. The farmhouse originally was where we came in the front door. That would have been the main entrance to the house. And it went up to this fireplace right here. And that was the end of the house. The house goes up this way, and it was a two-story house, which was kind of unusual. It's a big house for that time. The interesting thing about the fireplace here is that this would have been the center of the house. Hearth and home, as they used to say, you know. The fireplace was everything. It was light, it was heat, and it was a place to cook. Now, as it turned out, as houses evolved, we took the heating function and we put it in the basement. We called it a furnace. We took the lighting and we did other kinds of things with lighting, like oil lamps and later on electricity. And we took the piece that was concerned with cooking and we moved it into a separate room called a kitchen. But at that time, everything would have been done right here. And so you would have the farmer's wife working on the spindling thread here, and working on making fabrics for clothing. They did their own clothing, of course. Everything was self-sufficient. You had to be self-sufficient. There were no towns close by. The nearest town would have been in Pittsburgh, and that was a day's ride away. So you couldn't very well depend on shopping that way. They made a lot of their own things. This room would have been the main room, and you would have received guests here. Particularly things like on a Sunday, people might come over. This would be the Sunday meeting room, a parlor. And then there's always a room off to the side in these old houses. And this is one of them here, which we called a drawing room. And actually that comes from the words withdrawing, which meant that if you were having a conversation in here and say you wanted to have a little private conversation off to the side, you'd grab a hold of somebody and say, come on, let's go in here and talk. And then there'd be a separate room where you could go. Now, as time went on, this became a bedroom, a downstairs bedroom, and as I said, the house was lived in all the way through to the 1970s. So the functions of the rooms change, but originally that would have been the setup here. Okay, well, this room, as I said, it would have been at one time a downstairs bedroom probably, but we've created a kind of museum room here, and we put in a lot of the things that have been donated to us over the years, and tried to give some idea of what local history was like. There are, for example, a collection of arrowheads that were found in this area. Indian tribes were very active in the area right into the 1700s, and in fact they created some problems for some of our people. We had one of our pioneering families was raided and their house was burned down in the 1700s, late 1700s. And their neighbors helped out, of course, and that's what you did in those days, and they were able to get through the winter because the neighbors were generous enough to help their family out. But Indians were a constant problem at the very beginnings. We also have some other artifacts that were found around in the area, and we always encourage people to take a chance to look around and read about some of these things. This is a wedding dress also, again a different style and a darker color, and it was one of the dresses that was donated by the Beatty family. The Beattys were a very important family in our area. I mentioned a while ago that the Solomon boys came out and helped to run the farm, and their imprint on the farm has been considerable, and this particular section here has to do with that piece. Each of the brothers took something as their area of responsibility, and Harry Solomon was responsible for the horses. And what they would do is they would board horses out here for people from the cities, so that the people who had horses in the city came out and ran them on weekends and such, and Harry would take care of the horses. He would do all the vet business. In fact, they said you didn't need a vet if you had Harry because he understood your horses so well. He raised ponies, he raised trotters, and this particular picture shows him with a trotter, and that picture was taken right up here on the hill where Westinghouse now is, because Harry had an oval over there and he would run this thing around and train the trotters that he had there. Harry was one of those all-around kind of guys. He, when he got done with horses and they started to put tractors in on the farms, he would tear apart a tractor and put that back together, or trucks. He was just very capable kind of guy. And the other brothers all pitched in, and it was a working farm, a regular working farm with horses and livestock and lots of orchards right up again until the 1970s. Okay, well, this is the kitchen, and as I said before, kitchens were often added on to houses later on as people began to pull the stuff that was done with cooking out of the living room, out of the main room. When they added this on, which was sometime later on, and we don't know the date of this kitchen, they didn't have, of course, earth-moving equipment, so they couldn't go down to the same level that we were on and dig all that out to get a smooth surface. So what they did was they used the natural contour of the land. They built some steps and built the kitchen up as a sort of adjunct onto the what now became a sunken living room, so to speak. So the kitchen was up here. Now, this is another feature that is very unique to this house. This is a massive stone fireplace, as you can see. It's about 10 feet across, and you won't see the fireplaces of that size in these houses. It was used right on through the years. In fact, we sometimes puzzled about this thing, and we found out that the groove here was carved by people doing this with sharpening the knife over a period of years. So that was one of the things that we discovered. Again, the fireplace would have been the place where you would do a lot of your cooking, stews, casseroles, some kinds of bread typically would be done here. And later on, there'd be an outdoor oven typically, and we had one too, wherein you could do other kinds of things like baking cakes and things of that nature. You couldn't control the fire very well here, so you had to be have things that really could cook for long periods of time, and you needed an extra oven to do oven kind of things. Well, we have a lot of the 19th century furnishings that would have been found in a house like this along here. These are examples of grinding machines that were used for meat. All the meat, of course, was slaughtered on the farm and cleaned and then made into steaks or whatever, and then it had to be ground a lot of the time. And they'll use grinders like this and like this. This is a sausage maker, and it actually was used to, you put the sausage strings down here and grind it and shove it out through there. So they made their own sausages and things of that nature. Some of the items that we've found that were typical of the fireplace. This is a popcorn popper. This is a toaster. You can put the toast between the things and hold it over the fireplace. So that's very typical. And then I want to talk just a little bit about what we see on this end of things. Here we have some butter churns of various kinds. This is one of the first type, an old-fashioned butter churn, and you've probably seen these before. Later on, butter churns became this kind of thing, which was called a butterfly churn. The reason that butter is so important is because we often talk about the bread and butter of things and how important butter was and bread was, because when the farm families, when the workers would come in at 12 o'clock from the fields, they wanted to eat a lot, had big lunches, and it was mostly butter, bread and butter. So the bread and butter was a very important factor. This particular item here is a butter mold. Butter would be churned here, dumped in here. This press comes down, and there's actually an imprint there. And that imprint would have been to show that this was McGinley House butter. So you'd get a block of butter out of there. And that's what they would be doing for lunch. The other thing that is useful, and you'll find a lot of these in the old farmhouses, is this. It's a press. And you could actually use this for any kind of fruit. It was used for cider, apples, but also berries and grapes. And so you would move it down like this, press it down, and the liquids would come out here into a pail or some kind of receptacle that you had underneath there. You could even take your apple cider and age it a little bit and get a bit of a kick. Or, and what they did here a lot, was you could make your own moonshine. And in the 1920s, particularly, all the farms around here were engaged in the moonshine business on the side. It was a cheap way of making some extra bucks. All you needed was a place where the revenuers weren't around a lot. This is the backwoods. You needed water and you needed corn mesh. And if you had those three things, and all the farmers did, you could make your own moonshine. And what they would do is they would put bottles of this into a truck, drive over the hill down to Turtle Creek or Pitcairn or one of the big towns where there were city dwellers, and they would sell their moonshine. We have records of guys being chased on a pickup truck down through the streets of Turtle Creek by the local police. The local police, of course, got to figure out a lot of this stuff too, and they were hardly in the same classification as the federal revenue agents. But they sort of winked at some of this. But everybody knew that these places did it. Back here particularly where McGinley House is, it's an off-the-road niche, you know, with a lot of water running through here. And so it was an ideal place for moonshine. Okay, well that's the extent of McGinley House, and we'll take a few minutes to talk about the other house right up here on the hill. On with our tour, I want to point out something, and that is that over here you see an example of a farmhouse of western Pennsylvania, and this one was built around 1790. So this is a typical farmhouse. The pioneers, the first settlers in this area would have come out here. If they came out during the summer, they might have built a lean-to or something to get them through the winter, and the first thing that they did as soon as the weather started to clear was cut logs to get these 20-foot logs that they needed from the virgin forest around here, and they would begin to build their log house. Over time, over a generation or two, houses changed from these original log houses to stone houses, such as we see here in the McGinley House. Stone houses here were made with the original rocks and stones that were found in the fields. As you know, if you've been around here for any length of time, it's easy to run into rocks and stones when you're working in your garden. So we have plenty of those. So the stone farmhouse became the Western Pennsylvania farmhouse in the early 1800s and right on through most of the 19th century. Okay, well, what we're looking at here is the McCulley House, named after a couple of brothers named McCulley. Both of them had houses like this, and the houses were originally back behind the mall on James Street. So those of you who know where the mall is, it was up there, and that was where the house originally was. This house was what we called modernized, that is to say, there were walls put on it outside, insul brick over those walls, wooden walls, and underneath it all was this log cabin. If you'd driven past it, you would have never noticed. It was simply looked like an old, rather run-down house. It was abandoned after a point, and it was about to be torn down when someone from the Historical Society said, "Hey, wait a minute, maybe we can do something with this house." And so a group of volunteers, the municipality, Monroeville, some companies, the Historical Society all got together, and they moved this thing log by log from over there in its original location to here behind the McGinley House and reassembled it. And that was done several years ago, and it was a way to actually preserve the house and make sure that it would be available in a place where it really could serve a historic function. Okay. All right, well, welcome to the McCulley House. The McCulley House is a house as opposed to a cabin. Typically what people describe as a log cabin is a one-floor thing, and this happens to have 2 floors. So again, it's a little unusual. People with originally would set up a cabin like this. The style of it actually comes from the eastern part of the state where the German immigrants are. They brought this style of house over from Germany, and they began to create log houses and log cabins, and the frontier folks took that idea with them when they came into western parts of Pennsylvania. The interesting thing about this house is that it's the same dimensions that one typically finds on a log house, and that is 20 by 20 by 20 by 20. That's it. That was the entire place, one big room, 20 by 20. Now, when you stop to think about it, the farm families of the time would have 8 or 10 or even 12 kids. And so all those people would be in this room, this single room. And we all know what a Pennsylvania winter is like and how difficult it is to get through nowadays when we get cabin fever. So you can just imagine what happened then. Once that door was closed in November or December and the snow started to fall, everybody was here together. This is the kind of togetherness we don't think about with our families today, where at least we can sometimes go into another room or go upstairs and get away from the kids. But everybody was here together, so this was a different way of running family life. They didn't have the kind of diversions that we have today. Certainly kids today would be playing with their video games, and there was no electricity. So the games that they had were very simple, and there was a lot of reading and storytelling and a lot of togetherness with parents. One of the interesting things about this particular room is this artifact that I'd like to point out. And this was actually built by somebody who was one of our members who saw the design down in Jefferson's home down there in Monticello. And the interesting thing about it is it's a sort of a way of taking your light and moving it up, and then if you wanted light more in the room, you'd bring it higher and you could click it up there. Or if you were reading, you had your Bible and you were sitting here in the chair, you could drop it down and it would become closer to you there. So it was a very ingenious idea. And these people were very ingenious. They often had to come up with ideas on how to deal with life and how to make their lives a little bit easier, a little bit better. And they were very good at that sort of thing. All right, we're going to take a walk upstairs now. Well, this would have been the second floor, or the bedroom of the house. When you see log houses and log cabins as you cross the country, you'll find that a lot of them have an L on the side, or an extension. Some of them have a loft. Some of them even have a second floor, like ours does. So that in time, people might have started with a very basic kind of idea, but they built onto it, like we do today. As families increase and they got some time and some money, that make their houses a little bit more elaborate. So this was a chance then to get some sense of order out of the sleeping arrangements, for example. Maybe the kids would be downstairs near the fireplace, the adults would be up here with a couple of smaller kids, and you could separate out the family in that manner. Typically, again, there was no heat in these rooms, but you had quilts, lots of quilts that were put on across the beds. This particular one was actually not an old quilt. It was made in 1976 for the bicentennial years. But there are some quilts that we have here that are actually antique quilts that would typically be made for the kinds of beds that they had at that time. This is a typical bed, and you can see that it's a rope bed. There's no box springs such as we have today. In fact, it said that expression, sleep tight, meant that your ropes had to be tight to sleep well. There would have always been some kind of a throw over that, typically with hay or straw in it as a mattress. And then on top of that, of course, you would have had the quilts. This also has a trundle bed, which would have been a very popular item in those days, where you could have one of the kids bunk out there and get it out of the way during the day. So the trundle bed is not a modern invention by any means. It's been around for quite a while. So that's pretty much what you would have found here. In the mornings, of course, someone had to go out. Again, one of the kids probably had the job to go out to the pump some water, or out to a pond and break the ice if it was in the wintertime, and get the water and bring the water up, and then you could use this as a sort of morning bathroom. The chamber pot would have been there, and someone had to take care of that business every day. And as we move along here, we're coming to another interesting feature of this house. And what you see here is an outside porch. This is extremely rare. You won't find this on most log houses. And interestingly enough, because the place was originally modernized, there was a wall that came right up here. And no one knew that this porch was here. The people, of course, who lived here did, because for them it was just an alcove right off of their bedroom. And they could store stuff in it, like an attic. They would store stuff. But when we pulled down the walls to restore this building to its original design, we realized that this was, in fact, an integral part of the building. These stringers here are about 26 feet long, so the 20 by 20 bonds goes out here, extends even further, and they were part of the original building. There's one under there, and there's one on either side. So that was the way the building was designed back in the 1790s. Well, I hope you enjoyed our walk back through time, and maybe you'll consider pausing in your busy lives to revisit Monroeville's historic houses. Information for visitors is available on our website. Maybe I'll see you then.